The Roman legionary was the most feared soldier in the ancient world, but his sword was only as sharp as the supply line behind it. For centuries, we have marveled at Rome's battles and conquests, yet we have mostly overlooked the hidden machinery that made those conquests possible. This is the story not of a single general's genius, but of an empire's logistical backbone. By the end, you will understand the invisible architecture of power that turned the Mediterranean Sea into a Roman lake. How did an empire feed and move armies across thousands of miles without modern technology? What was the secret system that allowed orders from Rome to reach the deserts of Syria faster than a horse could naturally run? The answer lies in a network of roads, warehouses, and bureaucrats so advanced it would shape the fate of the Western world. What does it truly take to hold an empire together? Rome's true battlefield was not a field of grass and dirt, but a vast, empty map. Every general knew the harsh equation of ancient warfare. A legion on the march was a small, hungry city in motion. A single soldier required nearly 3 pounds of grain each day, plus water, fodder for the pack animals and cavalry horses, and equipment that constantly needed repair or replacement. Multiply that by 40,000 men for a large campaign, and the numbers become staggering. An army could consume its own supplies faster than it could carry them. This created a fundamental, unforgiving rule. An army's effective range was not measured in miles but in days of food. Venture beyond that fragile radius, and the most disciplined fighting force in the world would dissolve into a desperate, starving mob, vulnerable to the smallest enemy. The Mediterranean world presented a scale that magnified this problem. To move from Rome to the frontier in Syria was a journey of over 1,500 miles. The sea, while a highway, was treacherous and closed by storms for half the year. Land travel was a slow, grinding ordeal of dust and mud. This was the empire's core strategic dilemma. You could raise a magnificent army, but you could only project power as far as you could reliably feed it. Logistics, therefore, was not a background concern for quartermasters. It was the ultimate constraint, the invisible cage that every conqueror had to break out of. Fail to solve it, and your grand ambitions would wither on the vine, long before you ever saw an enemy shield wall. The genius of Rome was recognizing that supply lines were not just chains, they could be forged into weapons. Rome's answer began not with a sword, but with a shovel. They built a network of roads so advanced it functioned as the empire's central nervous system. These were not mere dirt tracks worn by cartwheels. They were engineered arteries designed from the ground up for one purpose: to move men and material with relentless efficiency, regardless of the weather. The construction was a marvel of standardization. Surveyors would first lay out the straightest possible route, defying hills and valleys with a stubborn determination that still defines landscapes today. Then workers dug a deep trench, a foundation trench, and began layering. At the bottom went large stones for drainage, preventing the road from becoming a muddy swamp after rain. On top of that, a layer of smaller gravel was packed down, followed by a mix of sand and concrete. The final surface was often paved with large, interlocking blocks of hard stone, fitted so tightly a knife blade could not slip between them. This created a smooth, cambered surface where water would run off into drainage ditches on either side. The result was a road that could withstand the pounding of marching legions, the grinding of heavy supply wagons, and the torrential rains of winter. It was an all-weather highway, turning seasons of impassable mud into periods of reliable transit. But the engineering was only half the system. Every 1,000 paces, a stone pillar was planted at the roadside, a milestone. These were not simple markers. They were the empire's odometers and public bulletin boards. Each one was inscribed with the distance to the nearest major city, often to Rome itself, and the name of the official who commissioned or repaired that section of road. For a military commander, this was transformative data. He could now calculate with startling precision exactly how many days of marching it would take for reinforcements to arrive, or for a messenger to carry a dispatch back to the capital. He could plan supply convoys down to the day, knowing the distance and the reliable surface they would travel on. This predictability turned movement from a gamble into a science. A legion could march 15 to 20 miles a day on these roads, a pace unheard of for other armies bogged down in unpredictable terrain. Even more critical was the state courier system, the Cursus Publicus, which operated like an ancient internet. Official messengers, changing horses at relay stations spaced a day's ride apart, could cover over 150 miles in a single 24-hour period. An order from Rome could reach the governor of Britain faster than a rumor could spread across a single province, so these roads were far more than stone and gravel. They were lines of control, shrinking the vast empire into a manageable space. They turned the chaotic flow of men and supplies into a predictable, measurable current, allowing Rome to react to crises with a speed that felt supernatural to its enemies. The road was the first and most visible layer of the empire's logistical mind, a mind that thought not in terms of battles but in terms of time and distance. Yet the stone roads were only the physical skeleton of this system. To truly animate the empire, Rome built a network of movement and information on top of them, a state-run service known as the Cursus Publicus. Think of it not as a postal service for letters, but as the imperial nervous system carrying the lifeblood of commands and intelligence. At its heart was a simple, brilliant principle, the relay. Staggered along every major highway at intervals of about 1 day's travel on foot were way stations. Some were simple inns offering rest, but the critical nodes were the mutations, the change stations. Here, an official courier bearing a sealed dispatch or traveling under imperial warrant would not stop for a long rest. Instead, he would immediately swap his tired horse for a fresh, pre-positioned one from the station's stables. If he was in a light carriage, he might change the entire vehicle. This switch could be accomplished in minutes. The messenger then sped off down the road, his pace unbroken, while the station attendants cared for the exhausted animal, readying it for the next rider coming from the opposite direction. This constant, rotating flow of fresh horsepower shattered the old limits of distance. A single urgent message could now travel from the banks of the Rhine to Rome in just over a week, a journey that would take a lone traveler on a single horse well over a month. The implications for governance were profound. A rebellion reported in a distant province could be answered with specific, informed orders from the emperor or senate before the rebellion could fully solidify. Tax revenues could be audited and redirected. Laws promulgated in the capital could be read in frontier towns within a season, creating a tangible sense of a unified legal space. For military commanders, this was perhaps the greatest force multiplier. Intelligence about enemy movements no longer aged into irrelevance by the time it arrived. A general could receive reports, consult with Rome, and dispatch new orders to his legates with a coordination that made the Roman military appear omniscient to its foes. The Cursus Publicus did more than carry paper, it compressed time, making the vast empire feel small, responsive, and tightly controlled from the center. It was the pulse that proved the empire was alive and watching. But even the fastest messenger needs something concrete to report on, and an army needs more than information to survive. It needs mountains of grain, leather, and iron. But information and roads alone cannot fill a soldier's stomach. The true lifeblood of the empire, the fuel that powered its legions and pacified its cities, was grain. To manage this most basic of all resources, Rome created one of history's first and most sophisticated state-run supply systems, the Annona. It began, like so many Roman institutions, as a political solution to an urban crisis. The city of Rome had grown to over 1 million inhabitants, a density unprecedented in the ancient world. This massive population, including a large class of poor citizens, was a potential source of unrest. An empty stomach in the Forum was a greater threat to stability than any foreign army. So Roman politicians, starting in the late Republic, made a fateful bargain with the urban populace. They would provide a monthly ration of grain, sold at a subsidized price and later given for free to hundreds of thousands of registered citizens. This was the grain dole, a direct transfer of sustenance from the state treasury to the people's tables. It was a powerful tool for securing political loyalty and maintaining public order. A populace that was fed by the state was far less likely to riot. But this system demanded a colossal, reliable flow of food. Every year, a vast fleet of specially built grain ships, the Navicularii, would sail from the fertile provinces of Egypt and North Africa. They crossed the Mediterranean in convoy, carrying millions of bushels of wheat to the port of Ostia. There, the grain was unloaded into enormous, state-controlled warehouses called Courier, which lined the Tiber River. These warehouses were marvels of food security, built with raised floors for air circulation and thick walls to regulate temperature, protecting the precious cargo from rot and pests. This was the civilian Annona, a logistical undertaking of staggering scale that turned the Mediterranean into Rome's breadbasket. Yet the military saw its potential immediately. The same principle that kept Rome peaceful could keep its armies fighting. The Annona was gradually extended from the city to the frontier. Provinces were assessed not just for monetary taxes, but for quotas of grain. A village in Gaul or a farm in Spain would contribute a portion of its harvest not to some abstract taxman, but directly to the supply chain of the nearest legionary fortress. This created a direct, physical link between the prosperity of the empire's farmland and the strength of its border walls. A farmer in Britain, by paying his grain tax, was literally feeding the soldiers who guarded the gate against northern tribes. The system transformed the relationship between the army and the land it occupied. Legions were no longer purely extractive forces, living off plunder and desperate foraging, which inevitably turned local populations against them. Instead, they became anchored nodes in a predictable, bureaucratic system of supply. The Annona guaranteed the legionary his daily bread, allowing him to train, build, and patrol without the constant, desperate anxiety of hunger. It turned soldiers from scavengers into guardians, and because the system was managed by the state, it could be redirected in a crisis. Grain stockpiled for the city of Rome could be rushed to a frontier army preparing for a major campaign. The warehouses at Ostia were not just silos, they were strategic reserves, a buffer against famine and war. So the Annona was far more than a welfare program or a tax scheme. It was the metabolic system of the empire, circulating the energy of the provinces to the muscle of the military and the brain of the capital. It demonstrated a profound understanding that power in the ancient world was ultimately measured in bushels of wheat. Yet, even with full granaries, a final, critical question remained. How did Rome ensure that the right amount of supplies reached the right place at the exact moment they were needed, across thousands of miles of land and sea? The granaries of Ostia were the end of a journey that began 1,000 miles away on the waves of an unpredictable sea. To feed Rome, the empire had to conquer the Mediterranean not with galleys, but with cargo ships, turning its greatest geographical challenge into its most vital supply line. This maritime highway operated on a strict, ancient calendar dictated by the sky and the wind. From early June through mid-September, the seas were considered open. This was the season of safe sailing when predictable northerly winds, the Etesian winds, blew steadily down from the Greek coast toward Egypt. A captain could raise a square sail and ride these reliable breezes south with confidence. The return trip, laden with grain, exploited a different pattern. Sailing west from Egypt to Italy was a more complex maneuver, often requiring ships to tack northward first to catch westerly winds before turning toward the Italian peninsula. By late September, the sailing season closed. The Mediterranean became a roiling, dangerous place of sudden storms, deemed mare clausum, the closed sea. Attempting a crossing then was a gamble with death, a risk no sensible merchant or imperial official would take for bulk cargo. This rhythm of the year forced the entire supply system into a frantic annual pulse. All the grain needed to sustain Rome for a year had to be harvested, taxed, loaded, and shipped within that narrow 3 to 4 month window. It created a logistical bottleneck of incredible pressure where timing was everything. To meet this demand, Roman shipwrights designed a workhorse of the sea, the corbitor. This was not a sleek warship built for speed and ramming. It was the container ship of antiquity, a vessel engineered for a single purpose, capacity. With a rounded, tub-like hull, it sacrificed speed and elegance for immense storage space below its single massive mast. A large corbitor could carry over 1,000 tons of grain, enough to feed tens of thousands of people for a month. Its design was all about stability and volume, slowly plowing through the waves like a floating barn. These ships were the unsung giants of empire, far more numerous and economically critical than any fleet of triremes. Their safe passage was a matter of state security. To protect them, the Roman navy did not typically escort individual merchantmen. Instead, it pursued a strategy of sea control, systematically clearing the Mediterranean of pirates and rival naval powers to create a Pax Romana on the water. They made the sea itself safe for commerce, turning it into a protected Roman lake. The organization of the grain fleets was a masterpiece of coordinated chaos. In Alexandria, the great granary of Egypt, and in the ports of North Africa, thousands of laborers worked under the watchful eyes of imperial officials. Grain, meticulously measured and checked for quality, was poured into sacks and carried up ramps into the dark holds of the waiting ships. These vessels did not sail alone. They traveled in convoys, a practice that offered safety in numbers and simplified naval oversight. The sight of such a fleet leaving harbor was one of the ancient world's great spectacles. Dozens of broad-beamed ships with their sails catching the wind, moving in a loose formation that stretched to the horizon. Their route was a well-traveled highway. From Alexandria, they would sail to Crete or another safe island for fresh water, then make the open water crossing to southern Italy, finally coasting north to the mouth of the Tiber. The final challenge was the river itself. Ostia's port was prone to silting, so larger corbiti often had to transfer their cargo to smaller riverboats for the last leg to Rome's warehouses. This entire chain, from Egyptian peasant to Roman miller, was lubricated by a system of incentives and guarantees. The shipowners, the navicularii, were often wealthy businessmen who received special privileges, tax breaks, and even state-backed insurance against shipwreck for contracting with the Annona. They were partners in empire, their private profit aligned perfectly with the public need for survival. So the Mediterranean supply chain was more than a shipping route. It was a seasonal ritual, an annual proof of Roman dominion over nature and distance. When the last grain ship of the season docked at Ostia before the autumn storms, it wasn't just delivering food. It was delivering another year of stability, another year of imperial life. Yet, moving mountains of grain across the sea was only half the battle. Once it arrived, how did Rome prevent this colossal bounty from rotting, spoiling, or being stolen before it reached the soldier's mess kit or the citizen's door? The grain ship's safe arrival was merely the beginning of a new challenge. To transform a floating mountain of wheat into daily bread, Rome needed something far more sophisticated than a simple dock. It needed a machine, a vast, humming logistical hub where the sea's bounty was captured, processed, and sent pulsing into the heart of the empire. The greatest of these machines was the twin port complex of Ostia and Portus, the empire's front door and its stomach. Ostia, at the mouth of the Tiber, was the original harbor, but as Rome grew, its natural river mouth port proved tragically inadequate. It was too small for the massive grain fleets, its entrance treacherous with shifting sandbars, and it was constantly silting up. A single storm could wreck dozens of ships and doom the city to hunger. The solution was one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the ancient world. Emperor Claudius and later Emperor Trajan did not just improve a harbor, they built one from scratch on empty coastline. They created Portus, a colossal artificial basin. Imagine workers digging a huge circular bay out of the earth, over 100 acres in size, and connecting it to the sea through a narrow, fortified channel. At the center of this new bay, they constructed a giant artificial island, topped with a majestic lighthouse to guide ships through the new entrance. This was not a natural harbor tamed, it was a harbor invented, a perfect geometric container for commerce, safe from the open sea's fury. But the real magic happened on the wharves. Here, the port transformed from a shelter into a factory for unpacking the empire. Massive stone warehouses, the Courier, lined every quay. These were not dark sheds, but multi-story, fireproof fortresses for food. Their floors were raised on pillars to allow air to circulate underneath, fighting damp and rot. Their walls were thick and windowless on the lower levels to maintain a cool, stable temperature, with small, high windows for ventilation above. Inside, the empire's wealth was sorted: grain, olive oil from Spain, wine from Gaul, marble from Greece, all sat in labeled compartments, the inventory of a continent. The process of offloading was a ballet of coordinated labor. Without modern machinery, the Romans used human ingenuity and simple physics. They employed massive wooden cranes powered by men walking inside giant treadmill wheels. These treadwheel cranes could lift nets holding several tons of cargo from a ship's hold and swing them gracefully onto the stone quay. From there, gangs of stevedores, organized under foremen, would carry sacks and amphorae into the waiting warehouses. Every single item was counted, measured, and assessed. This is where the port became a choke point for imperial control. A small army of clerks, scribes, and tax officials worked in offices right on the docks. As a shipment of Egyptian grain was unloaded, it was checked against the ship's manifest. A portion was immediately taken as a tax in kind for the state Annona. The rest, owned by private merchants, was assessed for import duties. The paperwork generated here on wax tablets and papyrus scrolls was the literal ledger of empire, tracking the flow of wealth from every province. Once processed, the cargo did not sit still. The Courier were not final destinations, they were dynamic switching yards. Grain for the city of Rome was transferred onto a flotilla of smaller, flat-bottomed river barges. These were towed up the Tiber by teams of oxen or men walking along the riverbanks, a continuous, slow-moving conveyor belt of food that ended at the warehouses underneath the Aventine Hill in Rome itself. Other goods destined for the armies might be loaded onto carts and sent marching down the Via Ostiensis, the road connecting the port to the capital, to be distributed along the great highways to the frontiers. So Portus was far more than a parking lot for ships. It was the empire's central sorting office, its customs house, and its strategic reserve all in one. It turned the chaotic, unpredictable bounty of the sea into an orderly, measurable, and controllable stream of resources. The quiet hum of activity on those stone quays, the scribble of clerks' pens, the steady groan of the treadwheel cranes, this was the sound of Rome feeding itself. It was the definitive proof that logistics was not a background concern, but the very rhythm of imperial power. Yet, with all this grain and goods flowing in, a final, ruthless question had to be answered. How did Rome pay for it all and ensure that every link in this colossal chain, from Egyptian farmer to Gallic wagon driver, performed their duty without fail? A legion on the march was a traveling fortress, carrying its own world within its baggage train. While the grand state systems provided the long-term fuel, the army's genius lay in its immediate, breathtaking self-sufficiency. Every soldier was in part a combat engineer. The legion did not just fight the land, it conversed with it, reshaping the terrain to serve Roman needs within a single afternoon. This mobile infrastructure began each day without fail with the construction of a marching camp. As the sun began its descent, surveyors would pace out a perfect rectangle on whatever ground the army occupied, from a German forest clearing to a Syrian desert plain. Using the simple tools of the groma for alignment and measuring poles, they laid out streets in a precise grid, with spaces marked for the commander's tent, the officers' quarters, and the rank-and-file legionaries. Then every single man set to work. With the short, stout shovel he carried, the dolobra, each soldier dug a 3-foot trench around the entire perimeter, piling the earth inward to form a rampart. Sharpened wooden stakes carried by the mules were planted atop this earthen wall to create a palisade. In a matter of hours, a fortified city of leather and wood would rise from empty ground, complete with guarded gates, patrol routes, and a clear line of sight in every direction. This nightly ritual was not about comfort, it was about psychological and tactical control. It transformed a vulnerable column into an instant, defensible stronghold, granting the army secure rest and a tremendous advantage. No enemy could launch an effective surprise attack against a force that, by dusk, was always behind walls of its own making, but the legion's building prowess extended far beyond its nightly digs. When a river blocked their path, they did not search for a ford, they built a bridge. The engineering corps carried prefabricated components, wooden piles and crossbeams on their wagons. Using rafts as working platforms, they would drive piles into the riverbed and rapidly assemble a sturdy timber crossing, often within a single day. If the terrain was swampy or uneven, they would construct temporary roads, laying down logs and brush to create a firm causeway for the heavy supply carts. This ability to overcome natural obstacles gave the Roman army a fluid, unstoppable momentum. They were not bound by existing geography, they could rewrite it as they advanced, turning impasses into highways. The tools that made this possible were as standard as a sword. The dolobra was a versatile pickaxe and shovel combination. The saw and the basket were for cutting timber and moving earth. Every contubernarium, the 8-man tent group, shared a heavy milling stone to grind their daily grain ration into flour. This embedded engineering capacity meant that for short-term operations, a legion could operate almost independently from the larger supply web. It could secure its own position, feed itself from carried grain, and move forward by creating its own path. This self-reliance was the sharp, mobile tip of the vast logistical spear. The state system ensured the legions could be sustained for years at a distant frontier, but the legion's own skills ensured it could strike, adapt, and survive from one day to the next, anywhere on Earth. The Roman soldier did not merely occupy space, he manufactured it, one fortified camp and one temporary bridge at a time. The true weight of empire was measured not in gold but in mule feed. To understand the scale of a legion's hunger, let's follow a single, standard legion of around 5,000 men on a summer campaign. Each soldier required a daily ration of roughly 3 pounds of grain, typically wheat. That alone consumed 15,000 pounds or 7.5 tons of food every single day just for the men. But the legion was not just men, it was a living system. Supporting it were hundreds of cavalry horses, each needing over 20 pounds of fodder daily. Then came the mules and oxen, perhaps 2,000 animals in total, pulling carts and carrying packs. A single mule could eat 15 pounds of hay and grain a day. Add in the water, which was not carried far but had to be found daily, requiring the army to camp near a substantial source. Then consider the spare weapons, nails, leather, tent canvas, medical supplies, and the soldiers' personal possessions. The sum total was a logistical avalanche in slow motion. This mountain of material did not magically appear. It traveled with the army in a long, snaking column known as the impedimenta, the baggage train. This was the legion's mobile life support, a sprawling caravan that often stretched for miles behind the marching soldiers. At its head might be the commander's personal effects and the legion's paid chest, heavily guarded. Behind that came the tents, the milling stones, the blacksmith's forge on a wagon, and the hospital supplies. Then the main body, a seemingly endless line of carts and pack mules, each creaking under sacks of grain, barrels of salt meat, and bundles of hay. The train was a universe of its own, populated not just by soldiers assigned to guard it, but by a trailing community of merchants, craftsmen, and soldiers' families. It was both the legion's greatest strength and its most profound vulnerability. The management of this colossal train dictated everything about how the army moved and fought. Its sheer size determined the marching speed. A legion unencumbered could cover 25 miles in a day on a good road. With the full impedimenta in tow, that pace dropped to a cautious 10 or 12 miles. Every river ford became an hours-long bottleneck of carts and shouting teamsters. Every narrow mountain pass became a potential death trap where the column could be stretched thin and attacked. A general's tactical choices were therefore brutally constrained by his baggage. A bold flanking maneuver or a rapid forced march meant leaving the train behind, a gamble that risked the army's very survival. To move without it was to become a raiding party, living off the land for a few desperate days. To move with it was to announce your presence with a slow, thunderous rumble audible for miles. This vulnerability made the baggage train the ultimate strategic target. An enemy did not need to defeat the Roman legion in open battle to cripple it. They simply needed to raid the impedimenta. A few hundred cavalry sweeping in to set fire to the grain carts or scatter the mules could bring the entire advance to a halt, forcing the Romans into a defensive posture or a humiliating retreat. Consequently, the train's placement and defense were matters of constant drilled procedure. On the march, it was often placed in the center of the column, protected by screens of cavalry and light infantry. When battle was joined, it would be circled into a makeshift fortress at the rear, guarded by the least experienced troops. The security of the impedimenta was the security of the campaign itself. Its slow, grinding progress was the sound of Roman power in motion, a reminder that for all the brilliance of roads and ships, the final mile of empire was always walked by a tired soldier behind a dusty, indispensable mule. A legion's marching camp was a fortress of the moment, but true imperial reach demanded fortresses of permanence. To project power deep into hostile territory, Rome mastered the art of pre-positioning, building forward supply bases that acted as logistical springboards. These were the frontier horrea, vast military granaries and warehouses strategically placed along the limes, the fortified borders, and along anticipated lines of advance. They transformed the map from a blank space of risk into a network of known, stocked waypoints. Before a single soldier marched for a new campaign, the empire's quartermasters were already there, filling these depots with the tons of grain, salted meat, weapons, nails, and leather needed to sustain an army for months. This practice solved the ancient commander's cruelest dilemma, the tyranny of the foraging radius. An army could now leapfrog from one secure depot to the next, operating hundreds of miles beyond the land's immediate capacity to feed it. A general planning an invasion of Germania or Parthia would not have to wait for slow supply trains to catch up from Italy. He would move his legions to the Rhine or Euphrates frontier, where years of careful stockpiling had already created a forward base bursting with provisions. From there, his campaign could launch with immediate momentum. carrying enough supplies to reach the next pre-stocked depot deeper in enemy land. This system turned campaigning from a seasonal raid into a methodical, year-long occupation. The most dramatic application was in siege warfare. To besiege a major city was to commit to a test of endurance that could last for years. The attacking army had to outlast the defenders, who were sitting on their own food stores. Without pre-positioned depots, the besieging force itself would starve long before the city fell. Roman generals, understanding this, made the supply line the first line of attack. When Julius Caesar besieged the Gallic stronghold of Alesia, his legendary double wall of circumvallation was as much a logistical barrier as a military one. But the critical, unseen factor was the depot he had established beforehand, ensuring his 8 legions could be fed for the many weeks the siege required. Centuries later, during the epic siege of Masada, the Roman army built a massive supply base at the foot of the desert mountain, a sprawling camp with its own granaries and water storage, to support the thousands of soldiers and prisoners for the months of brutal construction needed to build the assault ramp. The depot was the foundation of patience, the material proof that Rome could wait as long as it took. These forward bases were not just passive storehouses, they were hubs of activity and control. A major legionary fortress like those along Hadrian's Wall always had its own immense horium, a long, narrow stone building with a raised, ventilated floor where grain was kept safe from damp and rats. This fortress granary was the heart of the garrison's existence, its fullness a direct measure of imperial attention and stability. Local tribes knew that a full horium meant the Romans were there to stay, and an empty one might signal weakness or an impending withdrawal. The management of these depots fell to a specialized officer, the Praefectus Annoni Militaris, a military quartermaster whose job was less about combat and more about accounting and preservation. He maintained ledgers tracking every sack of grain consumed, every amphora of oil issued, and every piece of armor in storage. His success was measured not in battles won, but in the absence of crisis, in the quiet, ongoing fact of an army that was fed, equipped, and ready. This network of pre-positioned plenty was the ultimate expression of Roman logistical thinking. It represented a shift from reactive supply to anticipatory investment. The empire was not just feeding its armies in the present, it was planting the seeds for future campaigns years in advance. It turned the frontier from a brittle line into a deep, nourishing zone of imperial power, where the surest weapon was not the pilum in hand, but the bushel of wheat waiting in the dark, quiet granary just a day's march behind the line. But all these warehouses and roads would be meaningless if the sea lanes were not secure. The Roman navy, known as the Classis, had a mission far different from the dramatic sea battles of later ages. Its primary role was not to seek out enemy fleets for grand, decisive clashes, but to perform the essential, unglamorous work of a maritime police force and a logistics guardian. The Mediterranean had to be made not just a Roman sea, but a safe Roman highway. For centuries before Rome's rise, piracy was the endemic disease of these waters. Fast, light ships from places like Cilicia would raid coastal settlements and prey on merchant vessels, making predictable trade routes a dangerous gamble. A single pirate squadron could strangle the grain supply from Egypt, throwing the city of Rome into panic. The first great task of the Classis, therefore, was systematic pacification. Under leaders like Pompey the Great, the Romans launched massive, coordinated anti-piracy campaigns. They did not just chase pirates in open water, they methodically cleared the coastlines, destroying their hidden harbors and safe havens on land. This was a campaign of control over space, denying the enemy any place to rest, resupply, or sell their plunder. Once the major threats were subdued, the navy's work shifted to perpetual patrol. Squadrons of Liburnians, swift and maneuverable by reams, were permanently stationed at key ports like Misenum near Naples, Ravenna on the Adriatic, and Alexandria in Egypt. Their job was constant presence. They would cruise predictable shipping lanes, showing the flag and conducting inspections. For a merchant captain sailing from Carthage to Ostia, the sight of a Roman naval vessel on the horizon was not a threat, it was a reassurance. It meant the route was under imperial protection, that the rule of law extended even over the open waves. This security made the complex scheduling of the grain fleet possible. Merchants could commit their ships and cargo to the annual convoy knowing the risks of banditry were minimized. The Navy rarely provided close escorts for individual convoys that would have stretched their resources too thin. Instead, by guaranteeing the general safety of the sea, they created an environment where private commerce could flourish under the umbrella of Roman power. The Classis was also the empire's rapid reaction force for moving armies. When rebellion flared in a coastal province, legions could be embarked onto transports and sailed to the trouble spot in a fraction of the time it would take to march overland. During the Great Jewish Revolt, for instance, Vespasian used sea transport to swiftly move legions from Syria to various points along the Judean coast, applying pressure faster than the rebels could adapt. This strategic mobility allowed Rome to concentrate force with shocking speed, often appearing where it was least expected. The vessels themselves reflected this logistical mindset. While the Navy maintained some heavier triremes for the rare fleet engagement, its backbone was the Liburnian, a lighter, faster ship adapted from Illyrian pirates. It required a smaller crew, was cheaper to maintain, and was perfect for the long, boring, essential work of patrol and dispatch carrying. The sailors of the Classis were not the celebrated heroes of the legions, they were professionals performing a vital, routine service. Their victory was not measured in sunken enemy ships, but in the uneventful passage of 1,000 grain freighters, and in the quiet stability of a sea where trade, not terror, ruled the waves. By turning the Mediterranean into a predictable, policed space, the Roman Navy did more than win battles. It enabled the entire economic and logistical system that fed the armies and the capital. The true power of the Classis was felt in the full granaries of Ostia, not in the foam of a shattered oar. While the Navy mastered the sea, Rome's logistical genius flowed inland along a different kind of highway. The empire's arteries were not only paved with stone but carved by water. Rivers like the Rhine, the Danube, and the Tiber became the secret conduits for moving the heaviest, bulkiest supplies deep into the continental heartland, places where roads alone would have been overwhelmed. A single large river barge pulled by a team of oxen walking along the bank could carry a load equal to dozens of heavy wagons, and it could do so for weeks on end without tiring animals or breaking axles. This was the quiet, unstoppable power of riverine logistics. Where a road was built, a river was commanded. The empire's engineers did not just cross rivers, they harnessed them, turning natural geography into a force multiplier for imperial reach. The key was integrating these waterways into the larger system. A major legionary fortress was never built far from a navigable river. Take the frontier along the Rhine. Here, the river was not just a barrier against Germanic tribes. It was a bustling, two-lane superhighway for men and material. Forts like Castra Vetera or Mogontiacum were positioned at strategic bends or confluences, with their own fortified landing stages jutting into the current. Supply ships and barges, built in shipyards hundreds of miles upstream, would make the slow, steady journey from the interior of Gaul, laden with grain from the fertile plains, iron from the mines, and timber from the great forests. These vessels were the workhorses of inland transport, flat-bottomed and broad-beamed to navigate shifting shallows, their holds cavernous. Upon arrival at the fortress port, their cargo was unloaded directly into the waiting Courier, the military granaries that stood as sentinels of plenty on the very edge of the wilderness. This system extended the effective range of land-based logistics by an order of magnitude. A wagon train traveling from southern Gaul to the lower Rhine might take months, its progress slowed by mud, mountains, and the sheer fatigue of animals. A barge convoy making the same journey, however, moved with the relentless, patient force of the current. It could carry a volume of supplies that would have required a train of carts stretching for miles, and it did so with far fewer men and animals needed for the haul. The rivers also solved the critical problem of weight. Transporting millstones, artillery pieces, or prefabricated siege towers overland was a nightmare of broken wheels and exhausted oxen. By water, these colossal items could be floated directly to the construction site. When Emperor Trajan launched his Dacian wars across the Danube, his campaign was supplied by a vast armada of river craft, shuttling back and forth from bases in Moesia, enabling him to sustain a huge army in a rugged, hostile territory for years. The control of these rivers was military and economic in one. Roman patrol boats, smaller versions of the Liburnian, constantly plied the waterways, suppressing banditry and ensuring the safe passage of commerce. They established a Pax Romana on the rivers just as the navy did on the sea. Fortified ports became thriving towns, centers not just of military supply but of civilian trade, where local goods could be exchanged for Roman coin and manufactures. The river, in essence, became a moving frontier, a line of communication and control that pulsed with the rhythm of empire. It demonstrated that Roman power was not rigid or fixed to roads, but fluid and adaptive, capable of using the landscape's own pathways to sustain its presence. The silent, deep-bellied barge, creeping along a willow-lined bank, was in its way as potent a symbol of empire as the legionary's eagle standard. It carried the very weight of civilization into the unknown. All this movement of grain and goods generated a mountain of paperwork. The true nervous system of the empire was not made of stone or timber, but of wax and papyrus, managed by a quiet army of clerks whose meticulous records turned chaotic supply chains into predictable, accountable flows. At the heart of this system was the tabularium, the record office, found in every port, legionary fortress, and provincial governor's palace. Here, military scribes and imperial freedmen, often former slaves granted administrative roles for their literacy and loyalty, maintained the empire's memory. Their tools were simple but effective, a stylus for writing on wax-coated wooden tablets, and reeds dipped in ink for longer scrolls of papyrus. Every transaction, no matter how small, was documented. When a grain ship docked at Ostia, a clerk would note the ship's name, the captain, the point of origin, and the exact measure of its cargo as it was unloaded. That record would be matched against the ship's manifest from Alexandria. Discrepancies meant investigations, and the system was designed to leave a clear trail of responsibility from the Egyptian farmer who delivered his tax grain to the Roman baker who received it. This was the ancient world's version of real-time tracking. A quartermaster at a frontier fort could send a request to the provincial capital for 500 new tunics, 10,000 nails, and 100 amphorae of wine. That request was written down, copied, and filed. The shipment, when dispatched, came with its own set of wax tablets detailing every item. Upon arrival, another clerk would physically check the goods against the list, noting any shortages or damage. The signed receipt was then sent back along the Cursus Publicus to close the loop. This bureaucracy served one overriding purpose: to minimize waste and fraud, the twin cancers that could eat an empire from the inside. By creating a chain of written accountability, it became remarkably difficult for a local official to siphon off supplies for personal profit, or for a wagon master to claim his cargo was lost to bandits when it was actually sold on the black market. The paper trail created a culture of audit. Imperial agents could, at any time, demand to see the tablets for a particular granary or armory. A sudden, unexplained shortage in the records could end a career or worse. This constant pressure for accuracy meant that the empire had a surprisingly clear picture of its own resources. Senior officials in Rome could consult summaries and ledgers to know roughly how much grain was in storage at Carthage, how many swords were stockpiled on the Danube, and how many pairs of boots were wearing out in Britain. This data allowed for proactive management, redirecting surpluses from peaceful provinces to hotspots of conflict or need. The men who operated this system were the unsung engineers of imperial stability. They translated the physical world of sacks, barrels, and marching men into the abstract, manageable world of numbers and lists. Their work was monotonous, but it was the monotony of control, the daily ritual of pen strokes that ensured the legionary on the wall got his bread and the fleet at Misenum had its sailcloth. Without this bureaucratic engine humming in the background, the roads would have led nowhere, the ships would have sailed without purpose, and the granaries would have been hollow symbols. The empire ran on information as surely as it ran on wheat, and it was this marriage of physical logistics and administrative oversight that gave Rome its enduring, formidable strength. This silent river of information required one final, crucial ingredient to flow smoothly: standardization. Across an empire stretching from the rainy highlands of Britain to the sun-baked deserts of Egypt, local cultures spoke different languages, used different tools, and measured the world in different ways. This diversity was a logistical nightmare. Imagine a quartermaster in Gaul ordering 1,000 measures of grain from a supplier in Egypt. Without a common language of measurement, was a Gallic bushel the same as an Egyptian artaba? The potential for confusion, dispute, and fraud was endless, slowing the entire machine to a crawl. Rome's solution was elegantly simple and devastatingly effective. They imposed a universal toolkit of commerce, creating a seamless economic zone where goods and values could be understood from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. The most visible symbol of this was the coinage. The Roman denarius and later the gold aureus became the common currency of the empire. A soldier stationed on the Danube was paid in coins that a merchant in Antioch or a farmer in Spain would immediately recognize and accept at their known value. This eliminated the need for complex barter or dubious local currencies, streamlining the payment of troops, the purchase of supplies from local markets, and the collection of taxes. Money became a universal translator of value, but standardization went far deeper than coins. The Roman government decreed official units of weight and volume. The modius became the standard measure for dry goods like grain. The amphora, a distinctive clay jar with two handles and a pointed base, was not just a container, it was a pre-measured unit. A standard amphora held about 6 gallons, and its shape was a marvel of functional design. The pointed base allowed it to be stacked securely in the curved hulls of ships, locked together like puzzle pieces to prevent shifting during a storm. When a ship's manifest listed 100 amphorae of olive oil, everyone in the supply chain, from the Spanish producer to the Ostia dockworker to the military accountant, knew exactly what volume that represented. There was no need for time-consuming remeasurement at every handoff. This consistency was a colossal force multiplier. It turned the chaotic process of transshipment, the movement of goods from ship to cart to warehouse, into a predictable, almost mechanical operation. A worker in a port haulier did not have to carefully weigh out individual portions from a broken bulk shipment. He simply counted standardized sacks or amphorae as they moved from one ledger column to the next. For military procurement, the benefits were even more profound. The army could issue contracts for equipment across the empire. A workshop in Gaul could produce 10,000 pairs of caligae, the standard military sandal, to exact specifications, knowing they would fit any legionary from any province. A blacksmith in Italy could forge pilum heads that would fit the shafts produced in a forest camp on the Rhine. This interchangeability meant that losses in battle or wear on campaign could be rapidly replaced from centralized stores without needing a custom artisan to travel with each legion. The empire, in essence, began to operate like a single, vast corporation with universal parts and procedures. A provincial governor in Syria could read a supply report from a fortress in Britain and understand its numbers immediately because those numbers were recorded in the same modii, the same amphorae, the same denarii used in his own office. This shared logistical language reduced friction at every level. It minimized errors, accelerated transactions, and made the entire system auditable and efficient. The humble, standardized amphora, rolling off 1,000 different potter's wheels to the same specification, was as much a tool of conquest as the legionary's sword. It carried not just oil or wine, but order itself, proving that Rome's greatest power lay not in imposing its culture, but in simplifying the fundamental mechanics of how an empire functions. That universal system of measurement and coinage solved the problem of value, but it did not create the material itself. The mountains of grain in the Courier, the stacks of leather for tents, the ingots of iron for swords, all of this physical bounty had to come from somewhere. Rome funded its logistical machine not with abstract treasury funds alone, but with a tax system that harvested the very substance of the empire, turning agricultural and industrial production directly into military power. This was the genius of taxation in kind, a system where provinces paid their dues not only in silver coins, but in the tangible goods the state needed most. When a farmer in Egypt or a vineyard owner in Gaul calculated his annual tax burden, a significant portion was assessed as a specific quantity of wheat, barley, olive oil, or wine. He did not sell his crop on the open market to get coins to pay the taxman. Instead, he delivered the actual sacks of grain, the sealed amphorae of oil, directly to a designated imperial collection point, often a riverside granary or a port warehouse. This simple bypass of the marketplace was revolutionary. It meant the state's most critical resource, food, never entered the volatile world of civilian supply and demand. It flowed in a separate, dedicated pipeline from the fertile fields of the provinces straight into the storage cells of the Annona system. The same principle applied to other strategic materials. Regions known for timber, like the forests of the Balkans, might have their tax quota set in logs or pre-cut planks suitable for shipbuilding or fortress construction. Areas with strong leatherworking traditions would provide cured hides or finished tent panels. Mining districts paid in ingots of iron, copper, or lead. This method of taxation accomplished two monumental goals simultaneously. First, it guaranteed the state a predictable, physical supply of the exact materials required to sustain the army and the capital. A bureaucrat in Rome could look at a tax assessment ledger and know that by a certain date, 200,000 modii of wheat would arrive from Africa, and 5,000 amphorae of Spanish olive oil would be docked at Ostia, all without a single purchase order being issued. It turned the entire empire into a vast, decentralized factory whose output was pre-allocated to the needs of the state. Second, it stabilized local economies in the provinces. By demanding payment in goods the region naturally produced, Rome did not drain areas of scarce coinage or force farmers to engage in disadvantageous market speculation just to meet a cash obligation. A wheat farmer paid in wheat, a vintner paid in wine. This reduced economic friction and resentment, making the tax burden feel more natural, more a share of the land's bounty than an arbitrary financial penalty. The collection itself was a logistical operation mirroring the military supply chain. Imperial officials, often assisted by local authorities, would oversee the gathering of the tribute at regional hubs. The goods were measured using the standard Roman units, their quality checked, and then they began their journey. Grain from inland Gaul would be loaded onto river barges destined for the Rhine legions. Olive oil from southern Spain would be amphoraed and shipped to the naval base at Misenum. This system created a continuous, rolling wave of material moving toward the centers of Roman power. The tax in kind was the fuel injection for the entire engine. It meant that when a legion was ordered to march, the grain to feed it was already accumulating in depots along its route, paid for by the harvests of the very lands it was tasked with protecting. The soldier's tunic, his sandals, the nails for his marching camp, all were ultimately provided by the taxed production of the empire's artisans and workers. This created a profound, if indirect, circle of exchange. The peasant in Syria, by contributing his portion of the wheat tax, was helping to feed the legionary guarding the Danube frontier. The security provided by that legionary, in turn, allowed the Syrian peasant to farm in peace. It was a grand, unspoken bargain written not in law, but in the movement of sacks and amphorae. This method of funding through material tribute reveals the Roman logistical mindset at its most pragmatic. They understood that real power resided not in ledgers of currency, but in control over the essential stuff of life, food, fiber, and metal. By weaving their tax system directly into their supply chain, they built an empire that could sustain itself from its own body, a self-nourishing organism whose strength was drawn from the land itself. Yet this entire system, from the Egyptian wheat field to the legionaries' mess kit, relied on a force far beyond the imperial bureaucracy. It was powered by private ambition. The Roman state did not own the ships that carried its grain, nor did it directly employ the thousands of merchants who moved goods between provinces. Instead, it masterfully incentivized a whole class of private entrepreneurs, turning personal profit into public service. The most critical of these were the navicularii, the shipowners. These were not small-time captains, but wealthy business magnates who operated fleets of the massive Corbiter freighters. Their relationship with the state was a formal contract, a symbiosis of risk and reward. In exchange for committing their ships to the vital grain run from Alexandria or Carthage to Ostia for a set number of seasons, the navicularii received extraordinary privileges. They were granted exemptions from certain taxes and from the burdensome public services required of other wealthy citizens. More importantly, the state offered them a form of insurance. If a ship was lost to a storm or piracy, a common and devastating risk, the government would help absorb the financial blow, ensuring that a single disaster did not bankrupt a crucial contractor. This guarantee was essential. It made the immense capital investment in a large, deep-sea cargo ship a calculated business risk rather than a suicidal gamble. The navicularii became partners in empire, their commercial survival tied directly to the survival of Rome itself. Their profit came from two streams. They were paid a fee by the state for transporting the Annona grain, the tax wheat that fed the city and the armies, but their ships were never empty on the return voyage. The same vessel that carried public grain to Rome would be loaded with Italian wine, fine pottery, or Spanish garum fish sauce for the return trip to Alexandria, where these luxury goods fetched high prices. This practice, known as the return cargo, meant every voyage generated double revenue. The state got its grain moved cheaply and reliably, and the shipowner grew wealthy through diversified trade. This public-private blend extended to land as well. The mercators, the great merchant guilds, operated similarly. They secured contracts to supply the armies with everything from hard cheese and smoked bacon to woolen cloaks and nails. A guild based in northern Italy might have a standing agreement to provide the legions on the Rhine frontier with 10,000 pairs of boots per year. To fulfill this, they would not make every boot themselves. They would subcontract to smaller tanneries and workshops across Gaul, creating a decentralized supply web that linked local artisans to the global needs of the military. These merchants understood the army's standards and rhythms intimately. They knew that a legion on the move needed hardtack that would not spoil, and that a fortress in Britain required woolens of a specific weight for the damp climate. Their expertise became a vital component of the logistical machine. This system had a profound social effect. It created a prosperous, stable middle class of businessmen whose loyalty to Rome was cemented in gold and security. A shipowner in Ostia or a merchant in Lyon had a vested interest in the empire's continued peace and expansion. Rebellion in a province meant the disruption of his trade routes. Barbarian invasions threatened his contracts to supply the frontier. Their wealth and the employment they provided to sailors, carters, and craftsmen made them pillars of the imperial order. So when we picture the grain fleet sailing into Ostia, we should see not a government armada, but a convoy of private enterprise sailing under the guarantee of the state. The genius of Rome was recognizing it did not need to control every oar and wagon. It simply needed to create the conditions, safe seas, predictable law, and lucrative incentives, where private ambition would naturally align with public need. The hum of commerce was the sound of the empire feeding itself, a testament to the power of blending the might of the state with the energy of the market. The true test of this logistical machine was not on an open road, but in a trap of its own making. In the year 52 BC, Julius Caesar faced a nightmare scenario in the rolling hills of Gaul. He had cornered the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix and his massive army inside the formidable hilltop fortress of Alesia. Caesar's own force, roughly 50,000 men, now sat outside the walls. But a second Gallic relief army, reportedly over 200,000 strong, was marching to crush him between the fortress and their hammer blow. Caesar was not just besieging Alesia, he was about to be besieged himself. His survival hinged on a single, audacious engineering decision that turned Roman logistics into a weapon of geometry. He ordered his legions to build not one wall, but two. The inner wall of circumvallation, facing Alesia, was a 10-mile-long ring of fortifications to keep Vercingetorix in. The outer wall of contravallation, facing the open countryside, was an identical 14-mile-long ring to keep the relief army out. Between these two massive earth and timber barriers, Caesar's army would live, a thin defensive donut with enemies pressing in from both sides. This was more than a tactic, it was a logistical statement. Caesar was declaring that his army, isolated in hostile territory, could feed and supply itself indefinitely from within a constructed cage. The key to this impossible stand was not bravery alone, but the meticulous pre-positioning of supplies that had occurred weeks earlier. Before he even arrived at Alesia, Caesar had spent the campaigning season securing the region and, most critically, establishing a forward supply base. He stockpiled grain, meat, and fodder at a central depot, likely a fortified camp along a river for easy resupply from loyal territories. When he moved to invest Alesia, he brought a significant portion of this reserve with his baggage train. The legions arrived not as a raiding party, but as a mobile warehouse carrying the seeds of their own endurance. Once the dual walls began rising, the supply operation shifted into a defensive mode. Inside the fortified corridor, every inch of space was planned. Granaries were built under the protection of the ramparts. Bakeries were established to turn grain into hardtack. Foraging parties, protected by cavalry screens, would still venture out through gates in the outer wall to gather what they could from the controlled countryside, but the core sustenance came from within. Water was the most urgent daily need. The Gallic defenders had access to a river within Alesia, but Caesar's men, in their middle ground, did not. Roman engineers solved this by digging deep wells and constructing catchment systems for rainwater, a lifeline that turned their position from a temporary blockade into a sustainable habitat. The walls themselves were masterpieces of integrated logistics. They were not simple palisades. They were layered defensive systems with towers for artillery, pits filled with sharpened stakes hidden in front of the ramparts, and complex gateways that allowed controlled sorties for foraging or counterattacks. Building them required an immense amount of material, timber, earth, and iron nails, all of which had to be available within the enclosed zone or brought in before the noose tightened. This is where the pre-campaign stockpiling proved its worth. The siege was not a spontaneous reaction. It was the culmination of a supply plan laid months in advance. For weeks, the twin sieges ground on. Vercingetorix's men inside Alesia grew desperate, eventually expelling their non-combatants to conserve food, a tragic event that Caesar's forces could not afford to let through their lines. Outside, the massive relief army attacked the Roman outer walls in furious waves. Caesar's men, however, were not starving or low on arrows. They rotated from section to section along the 11-mile double perimeter, well-fed and supplied because their commander had treated sustenance as the first objective of the campaign. The final, decisive battle was a masterpiece of interior lines, where Caesar could shuttle reserves along the secure roads behind his walls to plug breaches, a mobility fueled by full stomachs and a secure base. When the Gallic relief army finally broke and fled, it was not just a military defeat, it was a logistical triumph. Alesia demonstrated that a Roman army, properly supplied and engineered, could operate as a self-sufficient fortress anywhere on Earth, turning the very act of surrounding an enemy into an unbreakable position of strength. Caesar did not just win a battle, he proved the empire's logistical doctrine could defy conventional military limits, sustaining power in the most impossible of places. The ultimate proof of this logistical machine was its ability to leap into the unknown. In the year 43 AD, the Roman Empire stared across a narrow but treacherous stretch of water at a land that represented the edge of their world, Britain. For Emperor Claudius, this was not merely a military conquest, it was a colossal test of administrative will. The invasion required moving an entire army across the unpredictable waters of the English Channel, a sea far more dangerous and unfamiliar than the placid Mediterranean, and then sustaining it on an island with no pre-existing supply network. This was not a campaign of gradual advance along friendly roads. It was a sudden, violent projection of power into a logistical void. The first challenge was the assembly of the invasion fleet itself. Historical accounts suggest a force of 4 legions, around 20,000 fighting men, plus an equal number of auxiliary troops, cavalry, and support personnel. To transport this host, along with its horses, siege engines, and initial supplies, required a flotilla of perhaps 1,000 vessels. These were not the deep-bellied corbetters of the grain fleet, built for capacity over speed. These were specialized landing craft, likely adapted from Gaulish and Batavian designs, with shallow drafts to navigate Britain's unknown beaches and river mouths, and flat bottoms to allow men and equipment to disembark directly onto the sand. The construction and marshalling of this fleet was a bureaucratic triumph. Shipyards along the coasts of Gaul, from the Rhine Delta to the Seine, hummed with activity for months. Timber was felled in inland forests and floated down rivers to the coast. Sailmakers, rope makers, and carpenters worked under imperial contract. The logistical planning extended to the very moment of landing. Each ship had to be loaded in a precise order, with the equipment needed first, weapons and tools readily accessible, and the heavier supplies carefully balanced to prevent capsizing in rough seas. The fleet did not simply sail from a single port. It was a coordinated convergence, with different legions embarking from different points, all timed to rendezvous at a staging area, likely near modern-day Boulogne, before making the final, dangerous crossing together. This assembly was a silent declaration of intent, a physical manifestation of Rome's capacity to organize matter on a continental scale. The Channel crossing was a gamble with wind and tide. Roman commanders, used to the predictable Etesian winds of the Mediterranean, now faced the volatile weather of the North Sea. A sudden storm could scatter the fleet and drown the invasion before it began. They crossed in the late summer, aiming for the calmest possible window, but the journey was still a tense, nauseating ordeal for soldiers more accustomed to marching than sailing. When the first waves of ships finally ground onto the Kentish shore, the real work began. The initial beachhead was not a battle line, it was a supply dump. Before pushing inland to engage the Britons, the Romans' first priority was to secure a port. They needed a place where follow-on ships, carrying the endless stream of grain, nails, and reinforcements, could dock safely. They quickly identified a suitable location and began constructing a fortified supply base, a bridgehead that would serve as the invasion's logistical heart. This base was a miniature Ostia transplanted onto a foreign coast. Warehouses rose from the mud to store the incoming provisions. A protected anchorage was established, perhaps with wooden jetties, to allow ships to unload regardless of the tide. This base became the umbilical cord to Gaul, the single point through which the lifeblood of the army would flow. Operating beyond the familiar Mediterranean system forced rapid adaptation. The Annona grain shipments from Egypt were useless here. Instead, supply had to be rerouted entirely. The fertile lands of Gaul, recently pacified, became Britain's breadbasket. A new, shorter but riskier supply line was established across the Channel. Convoys of ships now ran a continuous shuttle service, braving the rough waters to keep the bridgehead stocked. When the army advanced, it did so along rivers like the Thames, using water transport just as they did on the Rhine, to move heavy supplies inland. They also did something they rarely had to do in the Mediterranean heartland. They foraged and requisitioned heavily from the British countryside itself, turning immediate conquest into immediate supply, a necessary but risky strategy that could inflame local resistance. The Claudian invasion succeeded not because of a single brilliant general, though there were capable commanders, but because the Roman state could conceive of and execute a plan that treated an ocean crossing as a complex problem of engineering and supply. It demonstrated that the empire's logistical framework was not a static system, but a flexible toolkit. It could be reconfigured under immense pressure to project power across a new sea and sustain an army in a land where no Roman road yet existed. The legions that marched into the interior of Britain were not just carrying their swords, they were connected by an invisible, tenuous thread of ships, stretching all the way back to the granaries of Gaul. That thread, maintained against wind and tide, was the true measure of Roman ambition. But even the most brilliant machine has its breaking point. For all its sophistication, the Roman logistical system was not invincible. It was a network of perfect conditions, and when those conditions failed, the entire structure of imperial power could unravel with terrifying speed. The system's greatest vulnerability was its dependence on predictable environments, both geographical and political. It thrived on open roads, secure seas, and a single, uncontested authority directing the flow of goods. Remove any one of those pillars, and the machine would begin to stutter and choke. Perhaps no event demonstrates this fragility more starkly than the disaster that befell Publius Quinctilius Varus and his 3 legions in the dense, rain-sodden German forest in the year 9 AD. This was not a defeat born from a lack of courage on the battlefield. It was a logistical catastrophe that unfolded step by step as the environment itself turned against the Roman way of war. Varus was leading his army, complete with its massive, slow-moving baggage train, on a routine autumn march to winter quarters. He was operating under the standard assumption of Roman control, that the roads, or at least the cleared paths, were secure and that supply convoys could move freely. But the Germanic tribes under Arminius understood the legion's weakness perfectly. They did not confront the Roman column on open ground. Instead, they lured it into the trackless, muddy labyrinth of the Teutoburg forest. Here, the very foundations of Roman logistics dissolved. the engineered roads vanished, replaced by narrow, slippery game trails. The heavy carts of the impedimenta sank axle-deep in the mire, creating immovable blockades that broke the column into isolated, confused segments. The rain, falling in relentless sheets, ruined bowstrings, made shields waterlogged and heavy, and turned the legionaries' precious grain sacks into sodden, inedible pulp. The orderly system of supply and communication collapsed into a chaotic, localized struggle for survival. The legions, trained to fight in formation and resupply from their train, were cut off from their own life support. They could not build a proper marching camp in the choked undergrowth. They could not forage effectively in unfamiliar territory now swarming with enemies. The baggage train, that symbol of Roman self-sufficiency, became a death trap, a series of fixed points around which the Germanic warriors could swarm and overwhelm the scattered defenders. The defeat was total. 3 legions, some 15,000 men, were lost. The catastrophe was a brutal lesson in the limits of imperial power. The logistical machine was not magic. It required a compliant landscape, or at least one that could be engineered into submission. In the face of a truly hostile and disruptive environment, the system's complexity became a fatal liability. The disaster echoed for generations, permanently halting Roman expansion east of the Rhine, a stark border drawn not by treaties, but by the logistical reality of an unconquerable forest. Yet external terrain was not the only threat. The system was equally vulnerable to internal fracture, particularly during the civil wars that periodically tore the empire apart. The Annona, that great circulatory system, depended on a single, beating heart in Rome coordinating the flow from all provinces. When rival claimants to the throne emerged, each with their own armies and territorial bases, they would inevitably seize control of the key supply provinces. A general in control of Egypt could, and often did, cut off the grain supply to the city of Rome itself, holding the capital hostage to starvation in order to gain political leverage. The carefully balanced network of tax in kind and directed supply shattered into competing, smaller systems. A legion loyal to one emperor might find its traditional supply routes from Gaul suddenly interdicted by forces loyal to another, forcing it to live off a land quickly stripped bare or to abandon its position. The Cursus Publicus, the information highway, would be bifurcated, with messengers being intercepted or turned back at contested borders, plunging vast regions into a fog of war. The private contractors, the navicularii and mercators, faced impossible choices, their ships and caravans vulnerable to confiscation by whichever army controlled the port or road they were on. The elegant public-private partnership broke down into rampant piracy and profiteering. These periods of internal strife revealed a paradoxical truth. The very efficiency that made the Roman logistical system so formidable in projecting power outward also made the empire uniquely sensitive to disruption from within. The high degree of specialization and interdependence meant that a breakdown in one sector, like African grain shipments, could cause immediate, cascading failures in another, like the stability of the capital or the readiness of an army in Syria. The system was built for stability under a unified command, and it had few robust backups for when that command split into warring fragments. So the story of Roman logistics is not one of flawless, perpetual motion. It is a story of brilliant adaptation constantly tested by the chaos of the natural world and the ambitions of men. The roads, the ships, the granaries, they were tools of incredible power, but they were tools that required a steady hand to wield. When that hand faltered or when the world refused to be paved over, the machine could fail, and with it the illusion of eternal, effortless dominion. This inherent fragility leads us to a final, profound question. What happened when the world changed so fundamentally that the entire Roman model of supply became obsolete? The sprawling, dynamic conquests of the early empire eventually gave way to a new reality, a vast territory with fixed borders to defend. This shift from expansion to consolidation demanded a different kind of logistical genius, one less about projecting power forward and more about sustaining it indefinitely in place. The answer was the limes, the fortified frontier, which evolved from a simple military line into a self-sustaining economic world. Here, the Roman army transformed from a mobile consumer into a stationary producer, weaving itself so deeply into the local landscape that supply lines became nearly invisible. The key innovation was the permanent legionary fortress. Unlike the marching camps of the conquest era, these were cities of stone and timber, built to last for centuries. Think of places like Vindolanda on Hadrian's Wall or Carnuntum on the Danube. These were not just barracks, they were highly organized logistical hubs. At their heart stood the Principia, the headquarters, but right beside it was the Horium, the granary, its floor always raised on pillars to keep the vital grain dry and safe from pests. This granary was the fortress's beating heart, and its steady fullness was the ultimate measure of security. But how was it kept full, year after year, without bankrupting the imperial treasury with endless shipments from Gaul or Egypt? The Romans solved this by anchoring the army to the land itself. Surrounding every major fortress grew a civilian settlement, a vicus. This was not an accident, it was policy. Where the soldiers went, a market followed. The vicus housed the families of soldiers, but more importantly, it attracted traders, craftsmen, and farmers. A blacksmith would set up shop just outside the fortress gate to repair armor. A potter would produce the coarse ware for the soldiers' kitchens. Butchers, bakers, and brewers all established businesses to cater to the legion's needs. The military garrison, with its regular pay in reliable Roman coin, became the economic engine for an entire regional economy. This created a beautiful, efficient loop. The army spent its wages in the vicus, stimulating local production. That local production, in turn, supplied the army with fresh food, beer, clothing, and services. It reduced the need for every nail and loaf of bread to travel 1,000 miles. The fortress generated its own supply ecosystem. The most profound adaptation, however, was agricultural. The empire granted vast tracts of land adjacent to the fortresses, known as the Prota Legionis, the legion's meadows. This was not left as wilderness. It was farmed, often by retired veterans who were granted plots of land as their pension. These men knew the army's needs intimately, and they had a vested interest in the fortress's security, as it protected their own homes and fields. They would grow grain, raise livestock, and produce goods specifically for the military market. In some regions, like the Nile Valley in Egypt, we have papyrus records showing soldiers themselves being assigned to work on these military farms during planting and harvest seasons. The legion, in essence, became a major landowner and agricultural producer. This system of the fortress, its supporting vicus, and its cultivated prota created what historians call a military district, a largely self-sufficient cell of Roman power. The long, vulnerable supply lines from the Mediterranean core were still used for specialized goods, Spanish olive oil, Italian wine, or exotic spices for officers. But the bulk staples, the grain, meat, vegetables, and hay, could increasingly be sourced from within a few days' journey of the fortress walls. This was a logistical revolution in stillness. It made the frontier garrisons resilient. If a rebellion in Gaul disrupted the Rhine shipping for a season, the legions on the border could tighten their belts and rely on their local networks. It also Romanized the frontier in a deep, organic way. The soldiers, their families, the local farmers, and the immigrant traders intermarried and mingled. Latin was spoken in the markets, Roman gods were worshipped in the shrines, and a hybrid culture emerged, one born from the daily reality of supply and security. The limes was therefore far more than a wall or a line of watchtowers. It was a deep zone of economic and cultural integration, a living membrane where the empire metabolized the local resources to sustain its own presence. The goal was no longer to conquer new granaries, but to become the granary. This shift from extraction to local production was the empire's most sophisticated logistical adaptation, allowing it to stand guard for centuries. But this very success created a new kind of vulnerability, one where the center's power depended on the loyalty of its self-sufficient edges. This logistical machine, for all its efficiency, did not run on goodwill alone. It demanded a price paid in the transformed lives and landscapes of the entire empire. The constant, grinding need for ships, wagons, and warehouses reshaped provincial economies and ecologies in profound, often unseen ways. A legion's hunger was not just for grain, but for timber, leather, and labor, pulling entire regions into a single, imperial purpose. The most visible environmental impact was the hunger of the shipyards. To build and maintain the vast fleets that plied the Mediterranean and the riverways, Roman industry consumed forests at an astonishing rate. A single large merchant ship, a corbiter, required the wood of hundreds of mature trees for its hull, mast, and decking. The navy's Liburnians, though smaller, were built in squadrons of dozens. This demand created a voracious logging industry that marched steadily through the woodlands of Italy, Sicily, and later, the Balkans and North Africa. Hillsides were stripped bare not for farmland, but for the keels and planks of the empire's supply lines. This deforestation had cascading effects, potentially altering local climates, increasing soil erosion, and forcing the search for timber ever farther into the hinterlands, a quiet ecological cost of maritime dominance. Economically, the system created a vast, state-dependent undercurrent in society. Beyond the famous legionaries, millions of people found their livelihoods tied directly to the military machine. Think of the dockworkers in Ostia heaving sacks under the Mediterranean sun, their pay ultimately drawn from the Annona funds. The carters and muleteers who spent their lives trudging along the endless highways, their entire existence defined by the movement of imperial goods. The clerks in 100 tabularia, their eyes straining by lamplight to keep the ledgers straight. And of course, the sailors, a whole class of men who knew the sea not as a realm of adventure, but as a workplace of routine peril and backbreaking labor. These were not glamorous jobs, but they were stable. They offered a wage, a place in a system that for centuries seemed eternal. This created a peculiar form of social stability. A man in Ravenna might never see a barbarian, but if the Danube frontier collapsed, the contracts for supplying the legions there would dry up, and his job at the naval supply depot could vanish. The empire's security became his family's security, weaving a deep, practical loyalty that went beyond patriotism. The demand also sculpted provincial economies toward specialization. A region was not just valued for its beauty or culture, but for its output. Egypt became the empire's breadbasket, its agricultural cycles dictated by the need to fill the grain fleets on schedule. Spain became a center for olive oil and precious metals, its mines and presses working overtime to meet state quotas. Gaul produced pottery, textiles, and the tough pack mules needed for the baggage trains. This was not free market development, it was directed production. The tax-in-kind system guaranteed a buyer for these staples, encouraging investment and creating prosperity, but it also locked regions into specific economic roles. A bad harvest in Egypt was not a local tragedy. It was an imperial crisis that sent ripples of anxiety all the way to the barracks in Britain. This interdependence was the empire's great strength and its subtle weakness. It created a world where a shepherd in the hills of Thessaly, a potter in southern Gaul, and a sailor off the coast of Africa were all, in their own way, cogs in the same vast machine, their fates interconnected by the relentless need to feed, clothe, and move the Roman war machine. The legacy of this system, then, is written not only in stone roads and sunken ships, but in the very shape of the ancient Mediterranean world, its hillsides denuded, its economies channeled, and its people bound to the rhythm of supply. Yet this logistical mastery was not inevitable. To understand its true scale, we must ask a revealing question. Why did other great powers of the Mediterranean world, with similar resources and brilliant commanders, fail to build a system of such endurance? The answer lies not in a single invention, but in a unique Roman willingness to invest in the boring, long-term foundations of power. Consider Carthage, Rome's legendary rival in the Punic Wars. The Carthaginian state was a commercial titan, its wealth built on maritime trade networks that spanned the known world. Their ships were excellent, their harbors impressive. Yet their approach to logistics remained fundamentally transactional and short-term. They often relied on hiring mercenary armies for specific campaigns, paying them with the vast profits of commerce. This created a powerful but brittle military force. A mercenary army's loyalty lasted only as long as the money flowed. More critically, their supply was often an afterthought, managed through ad hoc contracts with local suppliers or through foraging from allied territories. When a campaign stalled or funds ran low, as they did after the First Punic War, the entire army could dissolve or turn against its paymasters in mutiny. Carthage treated logistics as a cost of doing business, not as the core architecture of rule. They built a magnificent navy to protect trade routes for profit, not to guarantee the annual bread supply for a capital city. This difference in priority proved decisive in the long, grinding conflict with Rome, whose citizen soldiers were sustained by a system designed for permanence, not just for the next battle. The Hellenistic kingdoms that succeeded Alexander the Great present another telling contrast. These were military superpowers, inheriting the formidable Macedonian war machine and led by some of antiquity's most talented generals. They possessed advanced engineering knowledge and built grand cities, yet their logistical systems were often extensions of a single ruler's personal authority, designed to support royal armies on campaign rather than to integrate conquered territory into a lasting administrative whole. A Hellenistic king like Antiochus III could march a magnificent army across Asia, but its supply relied heavily on the king's presence and the immediate spoils of war or tribute from cities along the route. The system was centralized around the monarch and his court. There was no equivalent to the Roman Cursus Publicus, a permanent state courier system functioning independently of who was in charge. Nor was there an empire-wide, standardized tax-in-kind system feeding a standing army at rest. When the king died or was defeated, the logistical network often fragmented as rival successors carved up the territory and its resources. Their infrastructure served the dynasty's ambition, while Rome served the state's existence. Rome's singular achievement was weaving military and civilian needs into a single, durable fabric. Other empires saw roads as military tools built for the march of armies. Rome certainly did that, but then it opened those same roads to every merchant, pilgrim, and farmer, turning them into engines of economic integration that paid for their own upkeep through increased trade and taxes. Other states had granaries, but they were often royal treasuries or military stockpiles. Rome's Annona fed the urban poor of the capital as a matter of state policy, creating a direct, stabilizing link between imperial supply and civic peace. Other bureaucracies kept records, but Rome's obsession with standard measures and duplicate receipts created a transparency and accountability that reduced corruption and waste on an unprecedented scale. This was the Roman difference, a holistic vision where the dockworker in Ostia, the mule driver on the Via Appia, and the clerk in a frontier fort were all part of the same vast, interconnected organism. It was an investment not in the glory of a season, but in the quiet functionality of centuries. This deep integration made the system resilient, able to survive individual incompetent emperors or military setbacks because it was embedded in the daily life of the empire itself. The true secret was recognizing that logistics was not a department of war, but the very foundation of civilization. Rome's enduring power was not written in the blood of a single battlefield, but in the grain ledgers of 1,000 warehouses. The ultimate lesson of its logistical machine is a profound shift in perspective, a redefinition of what victory truly meant. For Rome, grand strategy was not a map of conquest drawn once by a brilliant general. It was the patient, relentless work of building a world where conquest could be sustained, where every new territory became not a trophy to be displayed, but a functional component in a living system. This was the invisible victory, won not in an afternoon of combat, but across centuries of investment in roads, ports, and paperwork. The legionary with his sword was the sharpened tip of a spear, but the shaft that gave it force, the hand that guided its thrust, was this vast, interconnected organism of supply. A rival king could match Roman courage or tactical cunning on a given day. What he could not replicate was the silent, behind-the-scenes machinery that ensured a Roman army would still be fed, equipped, and in communication a year later and a decade later, long after his own moment of glory had faded. This logistical framework turned fleeting military success into permanent political reality. Winning a battle changed who controlled a piece of land. Winning the supply chain changed what that land was for, integrating its harvests into the Annona, its rivers into the transport network, and its people into the economic rhythm of the empire. The frontier fortress was not just a barrier against invasion, it was a statement of metabolic permanence, a declaration that Rome had learned to digest and thrive on the very edge of its world. This is why the empire's most formidable enemies were never other armies, but the forces that unraveled this intricate web. The dense German forest that choked the supply train at Teutoburg, the civil wars that fractured the unified command of the Cursus Publicus, these were attacks on the logistical nervous system, and they proved far more damaging than any head-on assault. Rome's genius, then, was an understanding that power is ultimately a question of reach, and reach is a question of supply. It chose to invest its wealth and ingenuity not merely in bigger armies, but in the capacity to support those armies anywhere indefinitely. It built for the long winter, not just the summer campaign. The true monument to this strategy is not the Colosseum, but the mundane, forgotten Horium on a windswept border, still full of grain while storms raged outside. It is the worn milestone on a road leading to a province that remained peaceful for 300 years. In the end, the most powerful weapon Rome ever forged was not the gladius, but the system that kept it sharp, fed, and in the right place at the right time for generations. That system created a dominance so deep and so quiet. It felt less like an occupation and more like the natural order of the world itself, the ultimate triumph of the invisible architecture over the chaos of mere force. The true testament of any system is what remains when the empire itself is gone. Rome's political dominion crumbled, its legions disbanded, and its emperors became dusty names in a history book. Yet the logistical machine it built left a ghost in the landscape, a series of imprints so deep they continued to shape the flow of life for millennia after the last Roman standard was taken down. The most obvious of these ghosts are the roads. For centuries, the great highways like the Via Appia or the Via Augusta did not vanish. They became the foundational arteries of medieval Europe, the routes pilgrims walked to holy sites, the paths merchants used to revive trade after the chaos of the Dark Ages. Kings and generals, from Charlemagne to Napoleon, marched their armies along the same meticulously graded roadbeds that had once carried Roman legions. The routes dictated where towns would grow, where bridges would be rebuilt, and how nations would eventually connect. The Roman road was more than a military tool. It was a geographical destiny, a permanent line drawn on the continent's memory. But the legacy runs far deeper than stone. the administrative DNA of the Roman system survived in the very concept of the state. The idea that a government has a responsibility to ensure the food supply of its capital, the notion of a standing army sustained by a regular tax system rather than plunder, the practice of using standardized weights and measures to facilitate commerce and collection, these were Roman innovations that never truly disappeared. Medieval kingdoms, though fragmented, often reached back to Roman law and administrative practice when they sought to rebuild order. The very word Annona faded, but the principle of public grain supply echoed in the communal granaries of medieval cities and the market regulations of early modern states. Perhaps the most profound legacy is the conceptual one, the idea that infrastructure is power. Rome demonstrated on a scale never before seen that the might of a civilization is not measured by the height of its palace walls, but by the reach of its supply line. It proved that to control a territory, you must first be able to feed an outpost there, communicate with it reliably, and move resources to it predictably. This lesson was not lost on later empires. The builders of the Silk Road, the administrators of the Byzantine Empire that directly inherited Rome's eastern apparatus, and even the planners of modern nations, all operated on a fundamentally Roman premise that enduring control is a logistical and administrative challenge as much as a military one. The next time you see a straight country road following an ancient path, or consider the complexity of a modern global supply chain, you are seeing the distant echo of Rome's foundational insight. The empire's greatest monument was not a triumphal arch celebrating a single battle, but the invisible, enduring architecture of connection it embedded into the world. It asks us to look beyond the obvious symbols of history, the crowns and the treaties, and to see the hidden systems, the quiet networks of grain and information that truly determine who rules and for how long.